Hi everyone, the purpose of this video is to see how well Ghost of Tsushima performs on the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB. Since the game came out on PC, we certainly have seen a bunch of videos where people using different graphics cards and playing around with graphics settings to achieve what they deemed a good experience. Some have commentary, some don't even show their system configuration or the graphical settings of the game, thing that makes it harder to determine how much horsepower the game really needs at 1080p or 1440p. And the sad thing I have noticed is that 99% of the reviews out there are aimed towards those who only game on their PCs and nothing more. Those who are doing one task at a time. You know the drill. So I decided to break the norm on this review and simulate a realistic scenario of a power user slash content creator slash multitasker on the budget, since the 4060 Ti 16GB is really kind of mid-range geared primarily towards 1080p and 1440p. So let's say I am a video editor or a day trader or an audio engineer who got bored while working and just want to play the game without closing all the programs that I'm using for work. Is the game going to work well enough? As you can see here, what I'm using right now is a Ryzen 5950X at stock speed, and for the RAM I have 128 gigabytes of RAM. I'm already using 93 gigabytes, and for the main motherboard I have the TUF Gaming X570 Plus. As for the GPU, I have 4060 Ti 16GB, the Zotac model, which has two fans, small factor. And as you can see here, the top 5 programs I'm using, the programs that are using the GPU. This one is an AI program, and then Photoshop, Firefox, DWM, the Windows graphical interface program, and the Wondershare video editor. So just 5 programs are using 7.8 gigabytes of VRAM. So just when you see this, you would conclude that 8 gigabytes of RAM in 2024 is not enough. As you can see here, I already overclocked GPU and it's very stable. Here you can see the GPU core clock is around 2940, while normal people boost it around 2700. And for the memory clock we have here 10,251, while the other guys just keep it around 9,000. I did not touch the voltage, and as you can see here the temperature is around 64. And by the way, when it's idle it just hovers around 3229C. In here I'm using 11.5 gigabytes, 1000 watts power supply from Corsair, and a bunch of hard drives, peripherals, and expansion cards. Oh, as for the monitors, I'm using 4 1080p 60Hz monitors, which is a combined resolution of 4K. Right now I'm running 3 virtual machines and 4 large language models, trying to saturate the RAM, and still can't use all the 128 gigabytes. Here I asked a set of questions about Ghost of Tsushima to 4 different LLMs. Guess the new Llama 3 is the only one who has good answers. Feel free to pause the video and read. I'll do a proper text generation tutorial in the future. Anyway, full details in the description in case someone wants to get the same setup. By the way, this combination is very popular and cheap, especially these are the best and last parts that you can get on the AMD AM4 platform. So in this scenario, what I am usually aiming for is native 1080p 60 fps, no DLSS, with the highest graphical settings possible. Some games have a weird bug where they show low textures at 1080p, so I just play at 1440p or even 4K. That depends on the game, of course. And Vix, let me tell you something. There are plenty of people who prefer 60 fps ultra graphics over high refresh rate, low texture experience. Alright, with all that being said, let's test the game. So, this testing will be divided into two parts. Part 1, in which I will play the game using the 551 driver, and part 2, in which I will upgrade to the latest driver 555, since it's the new one for Hellblade 2, and see if it's really worth to upgrade. And finally, I will reboot and play without opening other programs. The game will be tested in 4 stages, all of which I will be playing at max settings with frame generation enabled, and at the end I will add DLSS quality for 4K. Let me explain what these numbers mean so we can avoid any confusion. This is the name of the CPU, its temperature, the overall percentage being used by all the applications. MSI Afterburner does not show the percentage being used by the game, so I've noticed that the game is using around 8 to 10%. We have here the wattage. Then the RAM, I'm using 89.7 gigabytes of RAM, of which we have 6.2 gigabytes being used by the game. Then we have how many FPS per second in the frame time. This is the name of the GPU, its temperature, the percentage of usage, and we have the wattage. Then we have the memory of the GPU. This is the overall number being used by all the applications. We have 8.6 being used right now, of which 6.2 is being used by the game, and this is the shared memory being used by the game alone. And we have the core clock 2.9 gigahertz, and we have the memory clock overclocked to 10,000. So let's start with the 1080p test. Upscale method is off, anti-aliasing TAA, NVIDIA Reflex low latency on, and DLSS frame generation. As for the graphics, I have set everything maxed out, and I won't change it. So what we are basically looking at here is an FPS of an average 84 to 96 and a RAM usage of around 6.5 gigabytes, VRAM usage of 5.6 gigabytes. The CPU usage is actually around 8 to 10%. The rest is being used by the other programs in the OBS. The only variable I changed was the resolution to 1440p. I kept everything maxed out with frame generation on. So let's check it out. Again, what we are observing on this old driver, the 551, is an FPS around 62 to 71. RAM usage being around 6 gigabyte point 6 with the VRAM around 6.5 gigabytes. With the 60 FPS, looks pretty good. Okay, so now let's try a 4K. Everything still the same. Everything maxed out. Boy, oh boy, look at that FPS. So what I am observing here is a RAM usage of around 6.4 gigabytes. VRAM jumped from around 6.5 to 8.8 gigabytes with an FPS average of 33 to 39. Yeah, look at that frame time as well. Jumped around 15 points. Regardless of the low FPS, it's still playable. With a bit of lag. Now let's try 4K with DLSS on. DLSS quality. Okay, we have a few more FPS here. From 33 to 45. So now we have around 47 to 51 FPS average. And the VRAM is around 7.9. It was before around 8.8, so we lost around 1 gig of VRAM just by using DLSS quality, but the RAM stays the same. Yeah. So let's compare two pictures here. The first one on the right is a 4K picture with the DLSS on, while the other one at 4K native without DLSS, just with the frame generation. What's astonishing here is the quality is the same. I didn't see any difference between the two. See the face? So if I were to play at 4K, it's better to play using DLSS because I won't notice any difference in quality. The game is very optimized for DLSS. So the good thing here is that the VRAM is around 8.2 or 7.6. For me, as I have the 16 gigabyte version, I won't see any difference in VRAM usage. Basically, I won't care. See, the total of the VRAM being used here is 11 gigabytes. I have 16. The problem rises with the 8 gigabytes version. So let's say if I want to play at 4K, we have here 7.6. Let's say even if I close every program on my computer, it just play the game, I still have 7.6 gigabytes of VRAM to allocate. But when you start Windows will be using at least 500 megabytes. So you will have to drop the quality of the textures or any other variable. This is why the 16 gigabytes version is a must, to be honest, in 2024. Okay, so let's try again at 1080p. This time I installed the new driver without rebooting, without restarting the computer, and I left everything, of course, maxed out. Okay, so what we are looking at again, it seems to me that we have the same numbers: 6.5 megabytes of RAM, gigabytes of RAM, 5.7, around 5.7 gigabytes of VRAM, and an average FPS of 86 to 95. Yeah, it's basically the same thing. This is the new driver 555.85. This one is made for Senua Hellblade, so it's the same. This time we are changing the resolution to 1440p, and of course everything is left as it is, maxed out. Why we do play on PC anyway? Just to max out the graphics, or otherwise we'll be using a console. Okay, so again, 6.5 gigabytes of RAM, 6.4 gigabytes of VRAM, and the FPS is still consistent from 62 to 69 FPS. A very good experience, 62 FPS. Like if I wanted to play like this, I will just lock the FPS to 60. Just have a good time. Okay, this time we are playing at 4K with the new driver. Everything's still the same. DLSS frame generation. And the TAA, everything maxed out. I did not reboot the computer after installing the new driver. It did not ask to restart, so anyways, as you can see, the RAM usage is around 6.7 gigabytes. The VRAM is around 8.4. Yeah, 35 FPS. Guess it's time to use DLSS quality. Okay, so after turning DLSS quality on at 4K, and leaving everything as it is maxed out. Let's see how many FPS we've gained. Okay, look at this. 6.7 gigabytes of RAM, 7.6 gigabytes of VRAM, and we've gained around 12 more FPS. And it's not that bad. It's a fair experience. The purpose of this final stage is to see if I will gain any significant performance boost after rebooting the computer. This is a 1080p test. Everything maxed out. Remember earlier the RAM usage was over 100 gigabytes and I had like 3 virtual machines and 5 or 6 AI programs running at the same time. The GPU usage was around 20% alone. So now I rebooted the computer. I have no program running other than the ones on the startup. So we have here 90 FPS plus we have 5.7 gigabytes of VRAM being used, and we have 6.6 gigabytes of RAM. So I gained around 6 FPS. Alright. So we are testing a 1440p resolution now. Everything's still the same. The graphical capabilities are maxed out with frame generation, TAA, anti-aliasing, no DLSS, and we see here a range of frame rate between 66 and 70 FPS with a RAM usage around 6.5 gigabytes and a VRAM usage of 6.5 gigabytes. It's pretty much the same. Yeah. 8 to 10% CPU usage. Yeah, that's the same. We still have one more test left. This is a 4K with frame generation, 4K native, everything maxed out. Yeah, let's see. So what kind of FPS we have here? It's around, let's say, 35 to 38 with 6.6 gigabytes of RAM being used with 8.7 gigabytes of VRAM. Yeah, it's kind of the same. Yeah, it's like the same as the first two tests. Let's see the DLSS. This is 4K resolution again. We are just adding the DLSS quality. Everything maxed out. So let's see if we've gained any performance. Oh yes. The FPS is around 49 to 53, which is around 12 or so FPS. We have 6.6 gigabytes of RAM and 7.9 gigabytes of VRAM. So between 4K, frame generation and 4K frame generation plus DLSS, we've gained around 12 FPS and we lost around 1 gigabyte of VRAM. Yeah, it's pretty much consistent. All the data seems consistent. So let's see our conclusions. So for the conclusion, I just took notes of the numbers that we've seen earlier, and just feel free to pause the video and check the data. And what I've learned from it is that from 1080p to 1440p we used 800 megabytes of VRAM more, and we've lost around 20 FPS. And when we moved from 1440p to 4K, we used 2 gigs of VRAM more, and we've lost around 30 FPS. While in 4K, from 4K to 4K DLSS, we have dropped 1 gig of VRAM and we've gained 12 FPS. Another point is that I haven't really seen any significant performance gain after updating the driver, even though the game kept showing me a pop-up whenever I started it telling me that it's better if I use the latest driver that has the optimized profile of the game. So my recommendation is that if you don't want to update the NVIDIA driver because of the issues that comes with updating, like Stable Diffusion or CUDA throwing errors after every driver update, then just don't. And the game, as you have seen, won't suffer from any performance loss. Final thoughts about the game. I'm very impressed with what the devs have achieved. The game is running smooth without any noticeable bugs or problems. The graphics settings are very detailed, and what I liked the most is that they separated DLSS upscaling from frame generation. Some games still have a bad DLSS implementation. It's hard to notice any quality loss between 4K native and DLSS quality though. I'm very impressed. If you like this review and want to see how other recent games perform on the 4060 Ti 16GB, then tell me in the comments and I will see what I can do. The next game I'm going to review is Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, then maybe Cyberpunk. Did you know that Cyberpunk at 1080p uses around 14GB of VRAM with the new Ultra Graphics patch? That means that the 4068GB place is in the trash. If you want to buy the same PC configuration that I have, then check the description below for the full list. Much cheaper than what you would get on the IM5 platform and very power efficient, and it may easily last you 4 to 5 years ahead. Depends on your workloads, of course. The topics I want to explore in this channel are related to Windows, as I would suggest some practical ways to improve privacy and security. We'll suggest the best programs that I personally use, starting by ditching Windows 11 and using Windows 10 Enterprise LTSC, which is really the spiritual successor of Windows 7 with very little annoyance from Microsoft. Some free stuff along the way, of course. See you in the next video. Bye.